The air in the cockpit of the TBF Avenger was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid, warm electronics, and the faint, sweet scent of the Philippine Sea filtering through the vents. It was 06:37 in the morning, October 25, 1944. For Ensign William C. Brooks, pilot, this was the definition of routine. Below him, the ocean was a dark, rumpled blanket of navy blue, just beginning to catch the first golden rays of a tropical dawn. His mission, like every dawn mission for the past week, was profoundly boring. Fly a lazy, prescribed circle around his home, the escort carrier USS St. Lo, and hunt for ghosts. Japanese submarines. Phantoms that were rarely, if ever, there. He and his two crewmen were part of a tiny screen of aircraft protecting a collection of ships known by the unglamorous code name Taffy 3. It was a fleet in the same way a handful of sheepdogs is a wolf pack. 6 small, slow escort carriers converted merchant hulls derisively called jeep carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. Their job was not to fight battleships. Their job was to ferry planes and protect the hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who had just landed on the beaches of Leyte Island. They were the rear guard, the support staff, miles away from the real war. The real war, everyone knew, was happening far to the north. Admiral William Bull Halsey and the mighty U.S. Third Fleet, a steel wall of fast battleships and fleet carriers, were guarding the San Bernardino Strait, waiting to annihilate whatever was left of the Imperial Japanese Navy if it dared to show its face. The plan, as explained in the briefings, was a masterpiece of naval strategy, a perfect trap for men like Ensign Brooks. Flying their lonely circles in the sky, the war felt distant. Almost over. He banked the Avenger gently, the heavy plane responding with a familiar, sluggish grace. A line of rain squalls, typical for the season, stood like a row of gray towers off his port wing. Standard procedure was to fly around them, but a gap opened up, a shimmering corridor between the clouds. On a whim, he nosed the plane through it. It was a shortcut, a way to break the monotony. The plane burst through the other side into brilliant, unobscured sunlight, and the world went sideways. Brooks froze. His eyes, accustomed to the empty expanse of the sea, were suddenly filled with ships. Dozens of them. They weren't scattered. They were organized, steaming in perfect, terrifying formation. His first thought was a surge of relief. Halsey must have detached a battle group and sent them south. But the silhouettes were all wrong. The shapes clawing at the horizon were alien. He saw masts that rose into the sky not like the simple, functional poles of American warships, but like intricate, menacing pagodas. His blood went cold. Every pilot, every lookout, every man on every ship in the U.S. Navy had drilled those shapes into his mind until they were nightmares. The high arching bow, the tiered superstructure. There was no mistaking them. He fumbled for his recognition cards, his hands suddenly clumsy, slick with sweat. He held them up against the canopy, comparing the stark black drawings to the impossible reality filling his windscreen. Congo-class battleship, Nagato-class, and then one that was bigger than the rest. A monster, a shape so vast it seemed to distort the horizon itself. Thick armor, a bristling array of guns, and a central pagoda that looked like a fortress tower. Yamato. It wasn't just a battleship. It was the battleship. The largest, most powerful vessel ever to sail the seas, a ship spoken of in the hushed, mythical tones usually reserved for sea monsters. And it wasn't alone. Brooks's frantic eyes scanned the formation. For battleships. 6 no, 8 heavy cruisers. A screen of more than 10 destroyers. This wasn't a raiding party. This was the steel heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. And it was steaming directly towards Taffy 3. The plan, the perfect, logical, beautiful plan drawn up on maps in the safety of Pearl Harbor, evaporated in a single, heart-stopping instant. The trap had failed. The guard dog, Halsey, was gone, lured away on a wild goose chase. The gate was wide open, and the wolf was now staring directly at the sheep. Brooks grabbed his microphone, his thumb fumbling with the switch. The words caught in his throat, a dry, metallic knot of disbelief and pure, undiluted terror. He wasn't just a pilot on a routine patrol anymore. He was the first man to witness the end of his world. He keyed the mic, his voice cracking through the static across the entire task unit. Enemy surface force sighted. For battleships, 8 cruisers, multiple destroyers bearing 090 distance, 30 miles closing on our formation at high speed. The report was so fundamentally impossible, so utterly contrary to the known reality of the entire Pacific War, that for a long moment, the only reply was silence. But Brooks could see it with his own eyes. The rising sun flags. The colossal bow waves being carved by ships moving at 30 knots. The great guns of the Yamato beginning to turn. They were real. And they were here. The comfortable certainty of the last few hours, of the entire invasion, had just shattered against a truth so brutal and so enormous it beggared belief. And now, hanging in the sudden, dreadful silence on the radios of Taffy 3, was the one question that mattered more than any other in the world: how in the name of God did they get here? On the flag bridge of the USS Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague was about to take a sip of his morning coffee when Ensign Brooks's fractured voice crackled from the overhead speaker. The Admiral's first reaction wasn't alarm. It was annoyance. A green pilot, probably spooked by the sunrise glinting off a friendly task force. He'd seen it a dozen times. For battleships? 8 cruisers? The boy was hallucinating. Get him back on the horn, Sprague grunted to his talker, never taking his eyes off the placid sea ahead. Tell him to check his aircraft recognition again. He's looking at Third Fleet. This was the official explanation. The only one that made sense. You have to understand the mindset in that command center. The absolute certainty baked into the DNA of every officer on that bridge. The Japanese fleet was simply not supposed to be there. It was a geographical, tactical, and strategic impossibility. The San Bernardino Strait, the only gateway from the north, was guarded by the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the history of the world: Halsey's Third Fleet. To believe Ensign Brooks was to believe that 6 fast battleships, 15 aircraft carriers, and nearly 100 other warships had somehow vanished into thin air. It was like a police captain in a locked bank vault being told a master thief had just walked through a solid steel wall. It wasn't just improbable, it violated the laws of their universe. More reports began to filter in. Another pilot, then another, their voices tight with a fear that was becoming harder to dismiss. Confirming sighting multiple bogies, definitely Japanese. Then came the detail that made the hair on Sprague's neck stand up. Sir, they have pagoda masts. Repeat, I am looking at pagoda masts. A hush fell over the bridge. Pagoda masts. That one, ornate architectural detail was a fingerprint. No American ship, no Allied ship in the entire Pacific had that distinctive, tiered superstructure. It was the unmistakable signature of the Imperial Japanese Navy's heavy fleet. The coffee in Sprague's hand grew cold. The official explanation was beginning to fray. The comfortable, logical world of the battle plan was cracking under the weight of this persistent, terrifying whisper from the sky. But it was still just a whisper. Eyewitness reports, even from multiple sources, could be wrong. In the fog of war, mirages were common. Then came the sound. A sound that didn't belong in their world. It wasn't the sharp crack of a 5-inch gun or the boom of a bomb. It was a deep, guttural roar, like a freight train tearing the sky in half, followed by a series of titanic splashes off the port quarter of the formation. They weren't close, not yet, but they were undeniable. A moment later, another series of roars and geysers of water, 100 feet high, erupted from the sea, this time bracketing the escort carrier White Plains. And at the base of each pillar of white water, a splash of obscene color, a sickly yellow, a lurid green, a garish red. Every man on Sprague's bridge knew instantly what he was seeing. Color dye markers. It was a Japanese naval doctrine, a way for the spotters on multiple ships to distinguish their salvos from one another as they zeroed in on a target. It was the second, undeniable fingerprint. This was no mirage. This was gunfire. And the size of those splashes, they spoke of a weight of shell that made Sprague's heart seize in his chest. These weren't cruiser shells. They were the calling cards of 14-inch, 16-inch, maybe even the mythical 18.1-inch guns of the Yamato. In that single, Technicolor moment, the official explanation, the comfortable, logical, high command-approved reality wasn't just contradicted. It was violently executed. The plan on paper, so neat and certain, was now a useless piece of fiction. The wall hadn't been walked through, the wall had never existed. The kindergarten playground was filled with wolves. Clifton Sprague looked out from his bridge, not at a phantom, but at the guns of the largest battleship force Japan had left, and he understood with chilling clarity that they were not firing at Halsey's Third Fleet. They were firing at him. The fatal assumption that had underpinned the entire American invasion of the Philippines had just been proven false, and Taffy 3 was standing squarely on the fault line. The comforting reality was gone, replaced by the brutal arithmetic of a single, horrifying fact: a handful of the slowest, thinnest-skinned ships in the U.S. Navy were now the only thing standing between Kurita's battle fleet and the naked, defenseless transports of MacArthur's invasion force. The revelation on Clifton Sprague's bridge was more than just a tactical surprise, it was a fundamental breakdown of reality. To understand the sheer gravity of that moment, you have to understand the strategic gamble America was making at Leyte Gulf. Imagine a house. The family MacArthur's invasion force is inside, vulnerable, sleeping in their beds. The front door is guarded by the world's biggest, meanest dog, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. The back door, a small, flimsy screen door, is watched by a few yapping puppies, Sprague's Taffy 3. The entire security of the house rests on one, single, unshakable assumption: any burglar is going to come through the front door. But now, standing on his bridge, watching colossal shells dyed in peacock colors tear up the ocean around him, Sprague was realizing the burglar hadn't just snuck around to the back. He had brought a sledgehammer, and the big dog was nowhere to be found. This wasn't just a localized threat, this was a potential catastrophe on a scale that could unravel the entire Pacific campaign. Let's zoom out. Look at the big map in General MacArthur's headquarters. Hundreds of troop transports and supply ships, thin-skinned and packed with men and ammunition, lay at anchor in Leyte Gulf. They were the heart of the invasion, the lifeblood of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers already ashore. They were utterly defenseless. A single Japanese battleship breaking into that anchorage would be like a fox in a henhouse. They could systematically obliterate the landing force from the sea, sinking the transports, destroying the supplies, and leaving the American army stranded, to be slowly annihilated by the Japanese defenders on the island. It would be more than a defeat, it would be a humiliation, a disaster that could set the war back by years and cost tens of thousands of lives. And Taffy 3 was the only thing standing in the way. It was a strategic absurdity. A sick joke. Let's do the math, the brutal arithmetic of naval warfare. The 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3 were not warships in the traditional sense. They were floating airfields with engines, their hulls unarmored, their top speed a sluggish 18 knots. The Japanese fleet, by contrast, was built for one purpose: to kill other ships. Their battleships were fortresses of steel, capable of 30 knots, and armed with guns that could hurl armor-piercing shells the weight of a small car over 20 miles. Taffy 3 had a grand total of 3 destroyers, ships armed with 5-inch guns that would bounce off a battleship's hull like pebbles. In a straight fight, Taffy 3 wouldn't just lose. It would cease to exist in a matter of minutes. Sprague, a man known for his calm, methodical nature, had to face a truth that defied every rule of naval engagement he had ever learned. His force was not a shield, it was a speed bump. His job, in this impossible new reality, was no longer to hunt submarines or protect his carriers. His job was to die as slowly and as inconveniently as possible, to buy whatever minutes he could with the blood of his men and the hulls of his ships, in the desperate, vanishingless small hope that someone, somewhere, would realize the nightmare that was unfolding and come to their aid. The ticking clock wasn't for a tactical victory, it was for their own survival. And the stakes were not just the lives of the 6,000 men under his command. The stakes were the entire American invasion of the Philippines. Failure here meant the potential for one of the greatest military disasters in American history. On the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, surrounded by the thunder of distant, giant guns, Sprague knew he had no good options. There was no cavalry coming. There was no brilliant plan. There was only the enemy in front of him, and the beaches full of vulnerable men behind him. He grabbed the microphone for the task force radio channel, his voice cutting through the rising cacophony of battle stations' alarms. He gave a string of orders that must have sounded like madness. He ordered his slow, clumsy carriers to turn into a nearby rain squall for cover, to make smoke, to launch every plane they had, regardless of whether they were armed for anti-submarine patrol or a ground attack mission. Then came the order that would seal their fate, an order so contrary to the logic of survival, it was almost suicidal. He turned his attention to his tiny screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. "Small boys," he ordered, his voice grim, "form up for a torpedo attack." It was the cry of a cornered animal, a command to charge giants with toothpicks. The point of no return had been crossed. The investigation was over. The fight for time had just begun. In the organized chaos of the destroyer USS Johnston S. Bridge, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans heard Sprague's voice crackle over the speaker. But Evans didn't need the order. A full-blooded Cherokee from Oklahoma and a graduate of the Naval Academy, he was a man who embodied the aggressive, almost predatory spirit of the destroyer service. While others on the radio were still grappling with the sheer impossibility of their situation, Evans was already in motion. His ship, the Johnston, was the first in the tiny screen, the point of the spear. Before Sprague's command had even finished echoing, Evans was giving his own. All engines ahead, flank. Left, full rudder. The Johnston heeled over hard, its deck tilting at a sickening angle, sending loose charts and coffee mugs crashing to the floor. The ship shuddered as its turbines spooled up to their absolute limit, driving the 2,100-ton destroyer forward like a greyhound released from its trap. Evans grabbed the ship's intercom microphone. "Commence zigzagging," he barked, his voice betraying no hint of the suicidal reality of what he was about to do. To his gunnery officer, he was even more direct. "Target the lead cruiser. Open fire." The destroyer hadn't even finished its turn when its 5.5-inch guns erupted in a deafening, percussive roar. A salvo of shells, minuscule compared to what was coming the other way, screamed across the 18,000 yards of water toward the lead Japanese heavy cruiser, the Yamato. It was a gesture of pure, distilled aggression, like a terrier barking at a grizzly bear. But it was a start. It was an announcement that Taffy 3 was not going to die quietly. This was the first clue, the first tangible piece of evidence for Admiral Kurita on the bridge of the Yamato, that his morning was about to get very, very complicated. From his perch, looking down at the tiny American ships, he must have felt a supreme sense of confidence. He had achieved the impossible total, complete, and utter strategic surprise. He held the lives of every man in that pathetic little fleet in the palm of his hand. He expected them to scatter, to run in terror. He did not expect them to attack. And yet, here was this lone, impertinent destroyer, charging headlong into the teeth of his entire battle line, its guns blazing in absurd defiance. Then, a second destroyer, the USS Hull, peeled out of the American formation and began its own charge. Then a third, the USS Herman. The small boys were coming. For the men on the Johnston, the world shrank to a terrifyingly simple equation. There was the vibrating steel deck beneath their feet, the salt spray whipping over the bow, and the horizon, which was now filled with the blossoming orange fire of enemy guns. Geysers of water, colored and colossal, began to walk their way across the sea towards the charging destroyer. The roar of the incoming shells was a physical presence, a tearing, ripping sound that ended in explosions so violent they felt like they were lifting the ship out of the water. But in the midst of this naval apocalypse, something incredible happened. A flash of light erupted on the bridge of the distant Yamato. One of the Johnston's 5-inch shells, on its own a mere firecracker, had found a mark. Then another hit, and another. On the Johnston's bridge, a cheer went up. They were drawing blood. It was a pinprick, to be sure, but it was a clue. It was a flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. It proved that these steel gods could be hurt. The discovery was electrifying. It transformed their suicide run into something more. It was no longer just about dying to buy time, it was about dying to inflict pain. Evans pushed his ship harder, plunging into the smoke screen his own vessel was now belching out, using it as a cloak to close the distance. He had 10 torpedoes in his tubes, 10 fish that were his only real weapon against the giants bearing down on him. To fire them, he had to get close. Dangerously, suicidally close. He raced forward, emerging from the smoke like a phantom, the Japanese fleet suddenly enormous in front of him. He was inside their optimal gun range now, but they were also inside his torpedo range. With a calm, steady voice, he gave the order. "Fire torpedoes." 10 sleek, deadly cylinders hissed from their tubes and sped silently on their way. The first precious clue had been found: the enemy, for all his power, was not invincible. He could be hit. He could be made to bleed. And as the Johnston turned hard to race away, its impossible mission accomplished for the moment, a massive explosion tore the bow off the heavy cruiser Yamato, sending it staggering out of the Japanese battle line, crippled and burning. The Terrier had just broken the grizzly bear's jaw. The mystery of how to fight these monsters was not solved, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of an answer. The explosion that ripped through the Yamato was more than just a tactical victory. It was a shot of pure adrenaline into the heart of Taffy 3. The radio net, which moments before had been a confusion of panicked sightings, erupted with triumphant shouts. A Japanese heavy cruiser, a ship that massively outgunned anything they had, was crippled, burning, and out of the fight. The impossible suddenly seemed possible. The promising lead that sheer, unadulterated aggression could work seemed to be paying off. Ernest Evans had shown them the way, and now, the rest of the small boys were following him into hell. The destroyers Hull and Heerman, along with the even smaller destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, plunged into the fray, their own torpedoes streaking towards the Japanese line. It was a beautiful, heroic, and utterly desperate charge, and for a few intoxicating minutes, it felt like the most brilliant strategy in the world. The Japanese formation, so perfect and disciplined moments before, began to waver. Kurita's captains, confronted with this swarm of suicidal gnats, were faced with a devil's choice: hold formation and risk taking a torpedo, or break formation to evade, disrupting their battle plan and scattering their firepower. Most chose to evade. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. The perfect, monolithic fist of the Japanese center force was unclenching. Ships were turning, slowing, their gun solutions being thrown into chaos. It was working. The simple, brutal theory was holding. And then, the enemy's genius, or rather, the brutal, simple physics of naval combat reasserted itself with sickening violence. The lead that had seemed so promising turned out to be a trap, not of cunning, but of arithmetic. The small boys had closed the distance to fire their torpedoes, but in doing so, they had entered a killing field from which there was no escape. On the bridge of the destroyer Hull, Commander Leon Kintberger watched as his ship became the focus of what felt like the entire Japanese fleet. Salvos from multiple battleships and cruisers began to converge on his vessel. Imagine standing in an open field while a dozen different people with shotguns all decide to shoot at you at the same time. There is nowhere to run. There is no way to dodge. The air itself becomes a storm of lethal metal. A 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo struck the Hull's aft engine room, instantly vaporizing it and everyone inside. The ship's speed was slashed in half. Another shell destroyed the aft guns. A third smashed into the bridge, killing or wounding nearly everyone there, and severing all steering control. The Hull was now a crippled, drifting wreck, bleeding steam and fire, but her forward guns, operating on local control, kept firing. The same fate was befalling the Johnston. Having fired its torpedoes, the ship was racing away when a trio of 14-inch shells and 3 more 6-inch shells from a light cruiser struck it almost simultaneously. The bridge was shattered. The engine rooms were torn open. Commander Evans, his uniform shredded and his body peppered with shrapnel, was blown from the bridge down to the deck below, where he found his way to the aft steering position, a simple wheel in an open steel compartment to con the ship manually. The Johnston, mortally wounded, was fighting on with the tenacity of a dying wolf. The initial, glorious success of the torpedo runs had been a fatal illusion. It had brought the destroyers close enough to be systematically butchered. Admiral Kurita didn't need a brilliant strategy to counter them, he just needed to keep shooting. The Americans weren't cunning investigators uncovering a weakness, they were moths flying into a blast furnace. The beautiful, simple theory charge, fire, survive had collapsed under the crushing weight of enemy firepower. The investigators were no longer the hunters. They hadn't just been plunged back into confusion, they had been plunged into a maelstrom of steel and fire, with the terrible realization that their best weapon, their only weapon, had just led them directly into a slaughterhouse. Their promising lead was a dead end, paved with the wreckage of their own ships. The slaughter of the small boys was a brutal education in the physics of naval warfare. The initial, Heady optimism evaporated in clouds of black smoke and superheated steam. From the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague watched in horror as his tiny destroyer screen was systematically dismembered. The hull was sinking. The Johnston was a burning wreck, fighting on with primeval fury but clearly doomed. The Samuel B. Roberts, a ship its crew called the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, was now taking the brunt of the Japanese fire, absorbing hit after hit. The first phase of the plan, the heroic, suicidal charge, had bought time precious minutes but at an almost unimaginable cost. And the main body of the Japanese fleet was still coming. Hope seemed to be a dwindling commodity. The carriers were still inside the relative safety of a rain squall, but they couldn't hide there forever. They were too slow. Sooner or later, Kurita's battleships would close the distance, and the real massacre would begin. The radio channels were a cacophony of damage reports and desperate calls for help. The situation was sliding from critical to terminal. And then, just as the last embers of hope were about to be extinguished, a breakthrough came from the most unlikely of sources. It wasn't a new weapon or a dramatic reinforcement. It was a single, frantic voice cutting through the static on the aviation channel. It was a pilot from the USS St. Lo, Lieutenant J.G. Paul B. Garrison. And his message was a plea born of pure desperation. "I'm out of bombs," he transmitted, his voice tight with the strain of yanking his Avenger torpedo bomber through the flak-filled sky. "Request permission to make a dry run." A dry run. A simulated attack. It was a tactic pilots practiced, but in actual combat, it was madness. It was like a soldier with an empty rifle charging a machine gun nest, hoping that bluffing would somehow work. Yet, other pilots, their own bomb racks and torpedo shackles empty, immediately picked up the cry, making a dummy run on the lead cruiser. Another pilot called out. "Out of ammo, but not out of guts," shouted a third. This was the breakthrough. Not a piece of technology, but a sudden, spontaneous, and utterly irrational change in tactics. The pilots of Taffy 3, flying their slow, vulnerable Avengers and Wildcats, had been doing their best, dropping their limited payloads of general-purpose bombs and torpedoes wherever they could. But now, with their ammunition expended, they collectively decided to become something else. They became a swarm of angry wasps, bluffing with stingers they no longer possessed. From the bridge of the Japanese flagship Yamato, the effect was utterly bewildering. Admiral Kurita and his staff had spent their entire careers wargaming naval battles. They understood gunnery duels, torpedo attacks, and carrier strikes. They did not understand this. Their lookouts reported American planes diving on their ships, forcing their captains to take evasive action, only for the planes to pull up at the last second without dropping anything. Fighter pilots, their machine guns empty, were making strafing runs, their propellers chopping the air just feet above the bridges of Japanese cruisers, hoping the sheer audacity of the act would distract the anti-aircraft gunners. One pilot, Commander Richard L. Fowler of the USS Kitkun Bay, flew so close to the pagoda mast of a cruiser that one of his men swore he could see the expressions on the faces of the Japanese officers. This was not a tactic found in any naval manual. This was psychological warfare, invented on the fly, by men who had nothing left to lose. And it had a profound, unexpected effect. It created chaos. Every time a Japanese gunnery officer was about to get a perfect firing solution on an American carrier, a zombie Avenger would appear out of a cloud, diving straight for his ship, forcing the helm to be put over hard to dodge a torpedo that wasn't there. The constant, harassing attacks, real and feigned, frayed nerves. They disrupted timetables. They made it impossible for the Japanese fleet to reform and focus their overwhelming power. The sky, which should have been empty after the first American strikes were spent, remained terrifyingly full. A new, far more dangerous path forward had just been revealed. If you can't sink their ships, you can still attack their minds. The zombie air attacks were a stroke of desperate genius, a tactic born from the void of empty bomb bays. On the American side, it felt like a chaotic, last-ditch effort to sow confusion. But from Admiral Kurita's perspective on the bridge of the Yamato, these phantom attacks were coalescing with other pieces of battlefield data to paint a new, deeply unsettling picture. He was an investigator, too, trying to assemble the truth from the violent chaos swirling around him. And the clues he was gathering were leading him to a conclusion that was both logical and catastrophically wrong. Let's step onto his bridge and see the battle through his eyes. First, there was the sheer ferocity of the American response. He had expected a panicked flight. Instead, he was met with a suicidal destroyer charge and an unrelenting, almost hysterical, air assault. In the rigid, honor-bound doctrines of the Imperial Japanese Navy, such a defense was not the mark of a cornered rear guard. It was the hallmark of a screening force protecting something of immense value. This was clue number one: the Americans were fighting with the desperation of men guarding their queen. Second, there was the problem of the torpedoes. His fleet had been forced to dodge dozens of them, from both the destroyers and the aircraft. Reports were flooding in from his ship captains evading torpedoes to port, enemy aircraft dropping fish. His flagship, the mighty Yamato, had been forced to turn and steam directly away from the battle for nearly 10 minutes to comb a spread of torpedoes, a maneuver that infuriated the Admiral and took his powerful guns temporarily out of the fight. The sheer number of reported torpedoes was staggering. This was clue number two: a volume of attack that seemed far beyond the capabilities of a handful of escort carriers. Now, add to this the new, bizarre tactic of the dry runs. His lookouts would scream about an incoming torpedo bomber. The ship would heel over to evade. The anti-aircraft batteries would blaze away and nothing would happen. The plane would pull up and fly away, only for another to appear moments later. To the Japanese, who had no way of knowing the planes were empty, this didn't look like a bluff. It looked like a coordinated, skillfully executed attack pattern designed to hurt his ships, to force them into specific channels of water, perhaps into the path of waiting submarines. This was clue number three: the Americans weren't just attacking, they were maneuvering him. Standing on his bridge, surrounded by the smoke of his own guns and the confusing reports from his fleet, Kurita began to piece these clues together into a coherent narrative. The ferocity of the defense, the impossible number of torpedoes, the relentless, coordinated air attacks that seemed to be pushing and pulling his fleet. The truth, as he assembled it, was becoming horribly clear. This could not be a flimsy screen of escort carriers. That was a deception. He must have stumbled upon the main body of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. Those must be fast fleet carriers hiding in the squalls, and this swarm of planes and destroyers was their powerful combat screen, sent out to fix him in place until the heavy guns of Halsey's battleships could arrive to annihilate him. This was the uncomfortable truth Kurita's investigation had led him to. The handful of sheepdogs looked, fought, and felt like a wolf pack. Every piece of evidence, viewed through the lens of Japanese naval doctrine and his own mounting losses, the Kumano crippled, other cruisers damaged, his formation in disarray, screamed that he was walking into the very trap that Halsey had intended to spring all along. The plan he had read on paper back in Tokyo had told him the Americans would be here, but the reality of the combat he was experiencing told him a far more dangerous story. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. The fatal assumption had flipped. The commander with the most powerful fleet on the sea now believed, with chilling certainty, that he was the one who was hopelessly outgunned. This new, terrifying truth now hardening in Admiral Kurita's mind was a ghost, born from the fog of war. It was a phantom conjured by the smoke of burning American destroyers and the sheer audacity of pilots with empty guns. Yet, for Kurita, it was as real as the steel deck beneath his feet. He believed he was facing the vanguard of Halsey's Third Fleet. And according to the plan, the grand, overarching Japanese strategy codenamed Shogo, his mission was not to engage in a decisive, all-out battle with the main American fleet. His role was that of a raider. He was to punch through to the Leyte anchorage, destroy the transports, and then withdraw. A prolonged engagement with Halsey's heavy units would be suicide and would achieve nothing. Now, a new voice entered the investigation, a voice that seemed to confirm Kurita's darkest fears. It came in the form of a series of intercepted American radio transmissions. The Japanese signals officers, listening intently to the frantic, uncoded American communications, began to piece together a story. They heard Sprague's desperate pleas for help, addressed to Admiral Halsey. They heard messages about fast battleships and carrier air groups. But language and context are everything. A Japanese intelligence officer, already primed to believe Halsey was nearby, would not hear the desperation in those calls. Instead, he would hear confirmation. The Americans are talking to Halsey. They are coordinating with his battleships. They are vectoring in his main air groups. Imagine a man, lost in a dark house, who believes a murderer is upstairs. He hears a floorboard creak. Is it the house settling? Or is it the killer, moving into position? To the man consumed by fear, the answer is obvious. For Kurita, these intercepted messages were the sound of the floorboard creaking. It was the system, the very ether around him, providing what seemed to be undeniable proof of his flawed conclusion. At 0911, after 2.5 hours of brutal, relentless combat, Kurita made his decision. The evidence was overwhelming. He was on the verge of being trapped and annihilated. His primary mission, the destruction of the transports, was now secondary to the survival of his fleet. He issued a fateful order to his scattered ships: cease action. Rendezvous north. On the bridges of the Japanese battleships and cruisers, the order was met with stunned disbelief. On the bridge of the battleship Congo, Captain Toshihiro Inaguchi watched the American carriers through his binoculars, helpless and burning. His ship was less than 10 miles from the USS White Plains, close enough that its secondary batteries were firing. They were tasting absolute victory. When Kurita's order came over the voice tube, he slammed his fist on the chart table. Turn back? He radioed the flagship, his voice thick with rage and confusion. The enemy is shattered. Victory is in our hands. Request permission to press the attack. The system was pushing back. Not an American system, but Kurita's own internal command logic. His subordinate commanders, the men with the ground truth view, could see the crippled, slow-moving carriers right in front of them. They knew this was no fleet in being. This was a flock of sheep waiting for the slaughter. They were the whistleblowers, screaming that the Admiral's perception of reality was dangerously wrong. But Kurita was the Admiral. He had the big picture, assembled from the ghost of Halsey, the phantom torpedoes, and the misinterpreted radio intercepts. He was the one responsible for the entire fleet. His commanders had the tactical view, he had the strategic burden. The uncomfortable truth he had constructed for himself that he was walking into a massive trap was now an unshakable reality. He could not, and would not, risk his entire force for what might be a Pyrrhic victory. The order stood. Reluctantly, incredulously, the Japanese ships, some still firing their guns even as they turned, broke off the attack. The most powerful surface fleet left in the Imperial Japanese Navy turned its back on a helpless and defeated enemy and began to steam away. On the bridge of the USS Fanshawe Bay, Clifton Sprague watched the unthinkable happen. He saw the Japanese ships that had been closing in for the final kill, suddenly alter course. At first, he couldn't believe it. It had to be a trick, a complex maneuver to reform for a final, overwhelming assault. He was a man braced for the end, and the end was simply leaving. The reports started coming in from his pilots circling overhead, their voices laced with sheer, joyous disbelief. I see the enemy fleet, they're turning. They're heading north. For the men of Taffy 3, it was a miracle, a divine intervention. They had survived. But for Admiral Sprague, the elation was immediately tempered by the brutal butcher's bill. The cost of truth, the truth that a handful of determined men could, through sheer courage, bluff the most powerful ships afloat, had been staggering. He looked out over a seascape littered with the evidence of that cost. The destroyer USS Hull was gone, slipped beneath the waves with most of its crew. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts had fought until its back was broken and was now sinking. And the USS Johnston, the first to charge, was a dead-in-the-water, burning hulk. Its commander, Ernest Evans, last seen steering his crippled ship from an open deck, would go down with his vessel and be awarded a posthumous Medal of Honor. This was the price. The heroes of the hour were gone. The men who had charged headfirst into the fire, who had held the line with nothing but 5-inch guns and raw nerve, would not see the sunset. The system, the cold, hard physics of naval combat had demanded its payment in full. The victory, if it could be called that, felt hollow, drenched in the salt of the sea and the blood of his men. And then, the final, cruelest twist of the knife. Just as the relief of Kurita's withdrawal began to set in, a new kind of hell arrived. The battle wasn't over. At 10:49, a new wave of Japanese aircraft appeared in the sky. But these weren't conventional attackers. These were the first organized kamikaze attacks of the war. The men of Taffy 3, their nerves shredded, their ammunition lockers nearly empty, Their ships, battered and barely steerable, now had to face this new, terrifying weapon. They were pilots who had been ordered not to return, their planes packed with explosives, their sole mission to dive their aircraft directly into the decks of American ships. It was a tactic born of the same desperation that had fueled the zombie runs, but bent into a horrific, suicidal shape. The depleted gun crews, exhausted and shell-shocked, threw up what little flak they had left. They managed to shoot down several of the attackers, but one broke through. A single Mitsubishi Zero, trailing smoke, dove unerringly towards the escort carrier USS St. Lo, the very ship that Ensign Brooks, the man who first sounded the alarm, had taken off from hours before. The plane smashed through the flight deck near the aft elevator, its bomb and flaming wreckage penetrating deep into the ship's hangar bay. There, a catastrophic chain reaction began. The hangar was still packed with fueled and armed aircraft that hadn't been able to launch. The kamikaze's bomb detonated a torpedo, which in turn set off a chain of secondary explosions, each one more violent than the last. Within minutes, the entire ship was a raging inferno. The disaster that Taffy 3 had so heroically averted by sea was now irrevocably unfolding from the air. 30 minutes after being hit, the USS St. Lo rolled over and sank, taking over 100 of her crew with her. This was the lowest point. The crushing, bitter irony of it all. They had faced down battleships. They had stared into the maws of 18-inch guns and bluffed their way to survival. They had won an impossible victory against the giants. And their reward was to be gutted by a single, desperate pilot in a flaming airplane. The miracle had been stolen. The crushing weight of their victory now felt indistinguishable from defeat. The sinking of the St. Lo was the battle's tragic postscript, a final, cruel act in a drama that was already filled with impossible courage and staggering loss. While the survivors of Taffy 3 were pulling their wounded from the sea, a different kind of drama was unfolding miles to the north. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of the mighty Third Fleet, was finally turning his ships around. He had spent the last several hours steaming north at flank speed, chasing a decoy force of Japanese carriers that had been dangled in front of him like bait. It was a perfectly executed feint, a masterful piece of strategic misdirection by the Japanese, and Halsey had taken it hook, line, and sinker. The entire morning, his radio room had been receiving Sprague's frantic, plain language pleas for help. Need fast battleships, Leyte Gulf. Enemy battleships and cruisers firing on my carriers. At first, Halsey and his staff had dismissed them. It seemed impossible. They believed, just as Kurita initially believed of them, that the cries for help must be an exaggeration, a misidentification. The cognitive dissonance was too great. The Japanese fleet could not be in two places at once. Their own intelligence, their own perfectly logical plan, said the enemy was to the north. But the calls from Taffy 3 grew more desperate, more specific, more terrifying. The tone shifted from alarm to agony. Finally, a message was relayed from Admiral Nimitz himself, the supreme commander of the Pacific Fleet, a message whose cold fury would become legendary. Turkey, Trots 2 Water GG from SyncPack Action Com, 3rd Fleet Info Comanche, CTF 77X, where is RPT, where is Task Force 34RR, the world wonders. The last four words, the world wonders, were padding, added by a communications officer to confuse enemy decryptors, but Halsey read them as a stinging, personal rebuke from his commander-in-chief. The reality of his catastrophic mistake finally crashed down upon him. He had been duped. While he was chasing ghosts, a real wolf had gotten into the sheep pen. With a curse that was said to have blistered the paint on the bridge, Halsey ordered his fleet to turn south. His fast battleships, the very force that Sprague had been begging for, the iron wall that was supposed to have been guarding the San Bernardino Strait, finally began to race towards the battle. But they were hours away. They would arrive to find only silence, oil slicks, and the scattered wreckage of Taffy 3's heroic sacrifice. The catastrophe, the direct confrontation between Halsey's battleships and Kurita's, had been averted not by the American plan, but by its spectacular failure. The unfolding historical event was a paradox. Sprague's men were saved precisely because Halsey's grand strategy had collapsed. They had been left alone, abandoned to their fate, and in that isolation, they had forged a victory from sheer will and desperation that no one, least of all the architects of the battle plan, could have ever conceived. The men of Taffy 3 had not been part of the plan. They had been the ones who had to pay the price when the plan fell apart. They were the contingency that no one had planned for, the forgotten variable that had, in the end, solved the entire horrifying equation. For years after the guns fell silent, the battle off Samar remained shrouded in a fog of confusion and controversy. On paper, it looked like a clear, if costly, American victory. A massive Japanese fleet had been turned back from its objective. But the question that haunted naval historians, that was debated in hushed tones in the halls of the War College, was why. Why did Kurita, with overwhelming victory in his grasp, turn away? The official story settled on a narrative of Japanese confusion, poor communications, and the cumulative exhaustion of his crews. It was a plausible explanation, but it felt incomplete. It lacked the central truth of the matter. The full picture didn't begin to emerge until decades later, as documents were declassified and Japanese officers, now old men, began to tell their stories to American historians. One of the most critical pieces of the puzzle came from the post-war interrogations of Admiral Kurita's own staff. In a quiet room, surrounded by American naval officers, Kurita's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Tameji Koyanagi, was asked the question directly. Why did you turn back? Koyanagi, a thoughtful, professional officer, explained the thinking on the Yamato's bridge that morning. He spoke of the ferocity of the American destroyer attacks. He detailed the relentless, unending swarm of air attacks. He laid out, step by step, the chain of logic that had led them to believe they were being drawn into a trap by Halsey's main fleet. And then, the declassified file was laid on the table. The key that unlocked the entire mystery. The final truth, the answer to the question that had hung in the air since Ensign Brooks first keyed his microphone, came from the logs of the Japanese radio intelligence units. They had intercepted Sprague's frantic, uncoded messages. But what the initial American reports had never fully appreciated was how the Japanese had interpreted them. A message like "I am being attacked by 4 battleships and 8 cruisers" was not heard by Kurita as a cry for help from a tiny escort carrier group. It was heard as a contact report from a screening element of Halsey's fleet, reporting on Kurita's position to Halsey's main body. They didn't hear a sheep crying in terror. They heard a hunter calling out the position of its prey. Taffy 3's terror had been Kurita's evidence. Their panic had been his proof. This single, fatal misinterpretation vindicated the men of Taffy 3 in a way no metal ever could. Their desperation, their panic, their suicidal courage, all of it had been perceived by the enemy not as weakness, but as a sign of terrifying strength. The zombie runs weren't a bluff, they were a masterful feint. The doomed destroyer charges weren't suicide runs, they were a textbook screening action. The protagonists of this story had been ignored by their own high command, left to die, and in the end, it was their very abandonment and the raw, unfiltered terror in their voices that had become their single most effective weapon. They had conducted the most successful psychological warfare campaign in the history of naval combat, and they had done so completely by accident. Their story stands as a brutal testament, an echo across the decades that asks a chilling question in the desperate arithmetic of war. When all plans have failed and all hope is lost, is the truest weapon you have left the sound of your own terror?